So our presenter today really needs little in the way of an introduction. Dr. Charlie Hall has been around for a while. He's he's professor and Ellison Chair in International Floriculture at Texas A&M University. He is also the chief economist of American Hort. He is an agricultural economist who specializes in the green industry and the economics of that industry. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Charlie Hall, and he'll give us a green industry economic outlook in these uncertain times.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris, and welcome everyone that's on the webinar today. Let me show my screen here. All right. You should see the title slides saying Green Industry Outlook. And of course, that outlook, what's that?
We can see it just fine.
Okay, perfect. All right. So that outlook, as I was just mentioning some folks just a few minutes ago, is constantly changing because the world is changing. Literally, the world is changing. How many times do you get to say that in the course of your lifetime? But there's some monumental shifts that are occurring that are going to require that we do business a little differently in the future than we have been in the past. Now, this should not be too much of a stranger to us because post-Great Recession, I've often said that we entered a period of hyper competition, and that we need to do things. We needed to build competitive advantages in the marketplace that separate us from the competition. Those competitive advantages today are much different than they were 15 years ago. So we have to bear in mind that change is the only thing that is constant. And we've gone through a number of disturbances in the market in the past. We've been through a number of what Clay Christensen called disruptive moments, and we survived those, or many people survived those. And if we do things right, then we're going to enhance our likelihood of surviving this particular disturbance. All right, so the question is, all right, then what do you mean by doing things right, Charlie? Well, I'll get to that here in just a few minutes. I want to start out with one of the slides that I use quite frequently in my presentations. Some of you recognize this particular slide, and I know that there's some folks online today that I've worked with closely in the past, and so this is no stranger to you. Although be it, I'm going to focus on different things today than what I normally do. This is simply a supply chain diagram of our industry, the green industry. Of course, you got your allied trade folks down here at the bottom. You can see where my cursor is. I'm circling all the manufacturing and extractive sectors and all the inputs that are created by these folks within the manufacturing distribution industry. And of course, growers right here in the center, this yellow circle, you got the minus 15%, almost minus 16% underneath that. What that means is that prior to the Great Recession and compared to today, we have 16% fewer growers in the marketplace. Now, not all that productive capacity left the industry, but we're a smaller industry. But I think I would contend that we're a much more efficient industry, or at least we were heading that way. There's a few concerns that I have that I'll talk about in a second. Now, from the grower sector, obviously, the plants usually move through the landscape sector and/or down here on the left-hand side, the retail sector. And if you look at the number of retailers today compared to what we had prior to the recession, we're 3.7% fewer retailers. But on the landscape side, look at this, positive 12.8%. Now, these are 2018 numbers. Those are the last numbers that the Census Bureau has. They've gone through all their final adjustments. They're still adjusting 2019 numbers. So these are a little dated, but they're pretty close. All right. So as an industry as a whole, we just finished up the economic analysis, the economic contributions that the green industry makes to the U.S. economy, $348 billion in 2019. That's significant, right? 1.3 million jobs across the country, Of course, jobs and dollars are what politicians look at. And so you have the ability to utilize some of this information in basically conveying your importance. Now, obviously, the factors affecting supply and the factors affecting demand are very critical for this industry. We have very little government intervention, and that which we do have tends to be a little oppressive in nature. When people think of taxes and regulations, they usually view those as oppressive, quote unquote. But we see a number of things happening. I already talked about the number of players in the market and those changes, but input prices have been increasing over time as well. And I'll tell you exactly how much that increase has been here in a second. And of course, technology is constantly changing, as is the price structure within the industry. And American Hort right now has a massive price study that's going on in the industry, because while I've been measuring input prices that growers have been using and the cost of those inputs, we've not really had a good database on the prices of flower shrubs and trees nationally and or regionally. And that's what we're trying to achieve with this big American Hort research project. So stay tuned for that. That's coming down the pike. And that's going to provide a very good resource for us in terms of making managerial decisions about our pricing strategies in the future. Now, on the demand side, obviously the demographics are working in our favor. Boomers still have a lot of disposable income, and boomers were the ones that put us on the map in terms of the green industry. We have shown quite resilience as consumers. We've shown a lot of resilience in terms of our propensity to spend, and consumer consumption is 70% of GDP, and consumers have carried the day in the last decade, even more so than exports or any other elements of GDP. So people are still willing to spend. The question is, given the disruption that we see right now, the uncertainty that goes along with COVID-19, are they going to continue to spend in the spring? Now, there's been various fiscal and monetary policy measures that I'll get to in a little bit that are trying to ensure that both of the supply side dynamics and demand side dynamics don't underrail or undermine our industry. And so we'll see how that plays out into the terms of the future. All right, now I have some data that I want to present that comes from a benchmarking program that I established 3 years ago called Your Market Metrics. And some of you online are a part of this program, and some of your numbers are in these benchmarks. And others of you are not in the program. So if you have an interest, I just put the website there. That's the only commercial I got today, guys, is yourmarketmetrics.com. Because we have right now 53 growers in the benchmarking program, and they represent about $1.3 billion in sales. So some of them are rather large, and some of them are kind of medium sized, and a few small that are in there. And this data, of course, is filterable. But this is some of the historic data. I'm not sharing any one particular firm's data here. I'm showing 50 firms from 2018 the shared their data. They are in the midst of compiling their 2019 data, the end of the year data. So we'll have those results shortly. I just didn't have them by now because, again, everybody just needed to finalize their books, and they're just now inputting those numbers. But these are aggregate sales for this particular group of the cadre of growers that are out there, both nursery and greenhouse growers. All right, you can see that aggregate gross sales, if you look at the trending there and you follow my cursor, aggregate gross sales have been increasing year over year since 2015. That's a good thing. Now, bear in mind, it took us until 2016 to get to the level we were at prior to the Great Recession. But this has been a very good trend that sales have been trending upward. Now, I'm going to mute my microphone for a second, so I got to clear my throat. So. All right, I'm back. Now, while the year-over-year increases in these bars is a positive trend, you see the slowing down in terms of growth, particularly 17 to 18. And again, I don't have the 18 to 19 numbers, but you see that growth rate. That's what that 3.8% meant. We only grew 3.8% in 2018 relative to 2017. Now, regionally, anecdotally, this is going to increase in 2019 in some regions of the country, and it's not in others. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out from the aggregate view. So from a gross sales or a net sales standpoint, and the difference between the two is mainly credits and allowances. There's a few other things that are in there, but you got the same basic trending going up, and then of course the rate of increase in sales has been slowing. Now, well, sales is one thing, but let's talk about the bottom line. All right, so let's start out talking EBITDA or operating profit, right? There's two different measures: earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, or operating profit, which is basically EBIT, earnings before interest and taxes. And you can see that that was going up and up and up until 2017 and declined in 2018. Same thing for operating profit, up and up and up, decline in 2018. See the same thing for net profit, the very bottom line for these growers, increasing up until the 17 and then decreasing in 2018. And again, it's going to be interesting to see the 19 numbers to see how this trend continues. All right, so let me just backtrack here. Whether you're talking about EBITDA or operating profit, or you're talking about net profit, same general trend in spite of sales increasing. All right, so that's why only looking at top line sales, that's not the answer. All right, you got to get down to some of these more bottom line figures. Now, interestingly, if you look at shrink, and I know some growers out there, some of you refer to shrink as dumpage, some of you refer to as scrap, but it's basically three things. It's what I generally consider shrink to be is both production losses, right? The losses during production, credits and allowances on product that you ship, but you didn't get paid all that you were looking to get paid for, and then speculation losses, right? And most of this is production losses right here. But you can see that the total there in 2015 is $68.5 million. In 2018 is $64 million. So guess what? If you consider the shrink that growers are incurring, now this is all of there's 50 firms here in this data. You consider all the shrink that growers are incurring, it exceeds the decline in net profit dollars, right? So you went from basically 60 million to about 38 million. So if what that tells me is if we controlled shrink a little bit better, we may not have seen net profit decline. But I know that inventories have been increasing. As inventories increase, the cultural practices, the level of care increases as well. Labor's been tight, so you get more inventory, same amount of labor or less labor. You can see where that opportunity for shrink occurs. And so this is a major, I always refer to shrink as the low-hanging fruit in the industry. Well, that bears it out. $64 million of shrink among just 50 growers. So it's a significant deal. Now, all of you that are online know this particular trend very well, payroll dollars. What you've been spending on payroll has been increasing fairly dramatically, although that rate of decrease or increase has slowed down. And okay, so that's the basic number. So let me just summarize there that those payroll dollars have been increasing. Now, the question is, by how much? Well, this is where I calculate, in addition to the data on income statement, balance sheet data that I collect, and some of the financial ratios I calculate in the Your Market Metrics program, I also calculate this index of prices paid by growers. And right away, I've got a typo there, 2019 index, save that. It's what I love about being on the webinar. You can make these adjustments on the fly. So 2019 index of prices paid by growers, 129.6. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that using 2007 as the base year, you set that to 100. This index is 129.6. That means that the inputs that growers buy to produce these flowers, shrubs, and trees have increased in cost by 29.6% of what they were prior to the Great Recession, right? And it's been 2.5% year over year from 2019 to 2018. Now, I have an industry insider report that I generate that's on American Hort's website. Chris mentioned I'm chief economist for American Hort, so you can check out some of the video of this particular index that I calculate, but I've got it right here, and there's a bunch of numbers here. Don't pay attention to all these numbers. So you see the inputs on the left-hand side: containers, media, fertilizers, labor, freight and trucking. And then that 129.6 is over here on the bottom left where I'm circling with my cursor, right? 129.6, there's the 2.5% year over year increase. Now, if you break this down a little bit, then labor is 141.6. That means that labor is almost 42% more expensive today than it was prior to the Great Recession. Labor has eaten our lunch in terms of our cost of production. And we're not going to get much, I started to say we're not going to get much relief in terms of those labor costs, but given COVID-19, we may see more unemployment and we may actually have an opportunity to hire some people. So we'll see how that plays out. So labor, that's number one cost component that we deal with. Second to that, this 130.5 for freight and trucking. Obviously, that's a very important input cost as well. All right, so this is just a general overview of those input costs. Now, usually in these presentations, I have a whole slew of economic graphs in which I show you kind of the main things that are going on in terms of interest rates and labor, employment, and so forth. I'm going to short circuit this, and I'm just saying that we're 128 months into the current expansion within our economy, right? Since June 2009, we've been basically in an expansionary phase rather than a contractionary period. We've been in an expansion phase in terms of our economy. It's a new record. The previous record was 120 months. So the economy has been doing adequately. Now notice I didn't say good, I didn't say great, because even during the Obama administration and now during the Trump administration, GDP growth has been in and around that 2.5% growth year over year. All right, so it's not as though we're knocking the ballpark with this 4, 5, 6%. Now we have quarters which we go up to 3.5% for that quarter GDP growth, but for the year over year, we don't see that. We see that consistent growth, and that you can go back to some of my other webinars, like last year's webinar, and I talk about the correlation between the working population and so forth. But I won't get in that today because we got other things to talk about. So I'm short-circuiting all those charts, and I'm getting right down to the crux. When is the next recession going to start? And you know that I basically look at a few things. Number one being the financial risk, because one of the things that made the Great Recession so detrimental to our industry was that we had growers that were over leveraged, they weren't managing working capital, and the financial sector was falling apart. And there we had extended credit where credit wasn't due from a consumer standpoint. People were buying houses that didn't really deserve the credit to get those houses. So we got ourselves in a major situation. The financial risk was pretty high. You can see during the recession there. Since then, the risk as measured by the St. Louis Federal Reserve, they have a financial stress index, and you can see we were reaching some all-time lows, and that financial risk is still below zero. So we're still in pretty good shape. Banks, lenders as a whole, Farm Credit East included, is in a much better financial position today than they were back in 2007 going into the recession. So that's, to me, that's really good news. Bear that out, because again, what made the Great Recession so detrimental and so hard was that we had a financial crisis in conjunction with a bubble that was bursting, and that being housing in this case. So that we'd had one or the other. We dealt with those before. First time we dealt with both of them at the same time. So we were rewriting the macro finance textbooks, where Ben Bernanke was, during that time period. Now, our growth has been slower than the national historic average, right? So this is the Chicago Fed's National Activity Index. This is the second thing I'll look at in terms of what I'm trying to gauge my own recession call, my recession forecast. I like this particular index because it's 80 different economic indicators rolled into one. And though we are growing slower than the historic average, we're still above this red dotted line, which demarcates, we economists generally agree, that when it gets down to below negative 0.7, that's generally reflective of a recessionary time period, right? So we're still positive there. Now, the unemployment rate is still in the safe zone. This red line, I've tried to guesstimate about 400,000. This is a 4-week moving average of weekly unemployment claims. And I tried to guesstimate 400,000 because that's a kind of a tipping point of when we know we're in recession, is when that unemployment claims get above that red line. So it's still in the safe zone. The yield curve, it's been bouncing between positive and negative, and that's, now I define the yield curve as the difference between 10-year bonds and the federal funds rate. Now in the media, you'll see 10-year bonds versus 2-year treasury notes and 3-month T-bills and so forth. But I look at it as the federal funds rate. And of course, the rule of thumb is that when this difference, when the federal funds rate intersects the lowest point of the 10-year treasury bond curve since the last recession, that's generally demarcating a recession 18 to 34 months hence. And that was back in December of 17. So here we are, 36 months, we're dead on in terms of what models now predict when recessions would occur. Of course, recessions occur from either one of two things: exogenous events and or bubbles bursting. Right, so bear that in mind. I'll come back to that. The other thing I look at is the leading economic index. It's put out by an entity called the Conference Board. And I want to mute myself one more time. I've got to clear my throat again. All right, and I'm back. Now, this leading economic index is, just as the name implies, it's a leading index. It's a foretelling of the economy 11 to 12 months down the road. And you can see that it's been increasing in general since, let me get my cursor here, it's been increasing in general since the recession ended and the recovery started, but it's been flattening. And you got a little bit of detail intersecting right here. So it's been flattening out, right? We're not in the same rate of increase, hadn't been occurring. But people still been buying flowers, shrubs, and trees during this time period, right? So at least up until the present time. Now, this little uptick in January, we don't have the February data yet, but I don't predict that will be the same trend, right? I say it's going to go down significantly. So when you consider, okay, so yeah, I took out a slide at this point. That's what threw me off there for a second, because at this point, I generally had the slide where I would tell you that there was a 40% chance or 50% chance of recession occurring in 2020 and 80% chance of recession occurring in 2021. That's the slide I had last year, right? I usually include that slide in every presentation. I took it out. Instead, this is the slide that I said, what could derail that outlook in the future, right? And notice I had 5 bullets: a bubble bursting or some exogenous event or events. Monetary policy can go awry. Sometimes the Fed tightens the policy too quickly and throws us in recession. But Also, I mentioned trade war effects. And yes, that's been impacting us over the last 3 years. There's no doubt that we would be performing at a higher level if it were not for the trade war that's been going on. That's been a drag on the economy. However, that alone was not enough to throw us in recession. Then I had a fourth bullet where I said OPEC reneging on output deal. And I told you about OPEC and their deal with Russia to limit supply of oil in the marketplace in order to affect the price in the marketplace. And I told you about the possibility of Russia being the renegade and saying, no mas, we're not going to play this deal anymore. And that's exactly what happened. Russia said no mas. Well, whatever you say, however you say no more in Russian, but they said no zitsky or whatever it is. They said we're not playing ball with this. We're going to produce as much as we can. Saudi Arabia took exception to that and said, I don't think so. And so they started unleashing their own supply. And of course, Saudi Arabia is a big elephant in the room. And so they carry a lot of weight in terms of their supply. And so we see what happened to oil prices, since over the last 10 days. They've been plummeting, right? So now that's coming to fruition. And because of COVID-19, known as the coronavirus, but coronavirus is something. I first read a paper on the coronavirus back in 2005. This is not anything new. We knew this was coming. It's just that our response to that was mitigated because, things kind of sneak up on us sometimes. And sometimes you get rid of departments that should be left in place in order to handle these kind of things. That's politics. Now, that's likely going to cause recession in China and through Europe because of this, with all the lockdowns and so forth. So a lot of these things that I said could derail my outlook, well, here they are. There they are. And particularly over the last week, they have been magnified with the lockdowns that we've seen in San Francisco, New York, and so forth. These are exogenous events that are very difficult to design fiscal and monetary policy for, because it's not necessarily a liquidity issue on the part of consumers. It's a health issue, which indirectly affects the liquidity that they have, which indirectly affects the consumption that consumers have. So this is really kind of the perfect storm of things that, I would have anticipated one of these things happening, or maybe two at the same time. But now you've got, of course, COVID-19, you've got the oil price war, trade war. That's the trifecta, right? Then all these other things coming into play. That's the trifecta. So the question comes back, when will the next recession start? And I said, number one, though the data through February do not bear this out, right? This is where economic data, it's always a lagging indicator or lagging insight that we have, because we measure performance and then we decide what to do about it. We are likely already in recession, though the data aren't there to prove it. Because when you see certain sectors, the airline sector, even the entertainment sector in Hollywood, et cetera, the hotels, motels, restaurant industry, this is going to be a big deal for those folks. And we're going to take a hit, particularly in Q2 and Q3 this year. Now, how big of a hit? Well, again, different modelers come up with different estimates. Personally, I think we're going to take a hit about 3% on GDP in Q2. That effect's going to lag, and it's going to decrease. In Q3, we'll probably take only a 2% hit. And again, that's kind of my best guesstimate at this point. The things are changing so rapidly. However, after that, we should start seeing some improvement Q4 and going into next year, right? This is going to be a sharp but short-lived recession, right? However, there are my fellow economists who are projecting an impact of 18 months. I personally don't see it lasting that long, right? I think these are recoverable things. The question is, are we doing the right things in order to accomplish the recovery from this? Well, of course, we got to ramp up our COVID-19 testing. That's one that just duh. That's it, and we should make it free for everyone. So that's a no-brainer. And we should incentivize sick workers to stay at home, right? And so we've been, I say we, the Congress has been trying to do that in the short run. They've got three phases of policies here. Phase one was all about development of vaccines and getting acquisition of medical equipment, so forth. Okay, we needed to do that. But even if we have the equipment, from what I hear from the medical industry right now, is, okay, I went to mute again and clear my throat again. All right, so what I hear from the medical profession right now is that you got to have people to run those machines and run the equipment that are trained. So that may be something that we're remiss. Development of vaccines, equipment, that's phase one. Phase two is all about Medicaid cost sharing with the states who are going to bear more Medicaid related expenses, all about expansion of unemployment and SNAP benefits, and then of course emergency paid sick leave for certain workers. Notice I said for certain workers, not all workers. That's a very big gap in terms of that policy. And of course, phase three is still being negotiated. You've heard here recently, and I was a proponent of this, that you could stick $1,000, $2,000 in every American's hands right today through some sort of stimulus package, a tax rebate, if you will, or a transfer payment, as we call it. Now, that's going to help bolster the demand side. It doesn't really address some of the supply side impacts. Now, since I'm there, let's talk about those supply side impacts. What are they going to be? Well, mainly the disruption of supply chains, right? So when we see so many people hunkering down, staying at home, supply chains are impacted. And not just here, but abroad. And we import a number of inputs into manufacturing and so forth. Some of the containers, peat moss, some of the plant protection products, right? Some of those are imported. And so that's our ability to get those in a timely manner is going to be interesting. So we got to see how all this plays out. Now, at the same time, I always ended my presentations, do you have a contingency plan in place? And I've modified this slide to say, now's the time to start implementing it, right? I asked you two questions over the last few years. How prepared are you for the downturn? What predetermined strategies should you have in place? And I talked about four main strategies. Now, for 4 years, I've been talking about this, about getting leverage properly, don't being over leveraged, don't let lenders have more skin in the game than you do in your own business. They are an important partner, but they shouldn't be the owner of your business, right? Making sure that you work with your lenders to establish proper working capital levels, right? That you have the working capital to weather these kinds of events. And I talked about being lean and efficient, doing lean flow events, making sure that you're gaining in efficiency, and for darn sure, make sure that your value proposition is such that your customers view you as being essential in their lives. Now, I've used that word on purpose because essential is exactly the term that municipal leaders are looking at right now in terms of what's considered to be essential businesses, and for consumers, what's considered to be essential purchases. Now, if you break down the average consumer budget, it's half and half in terms of what's fixed and then, excuse me, what is variable. And we need to make sure that flowers, shrubs, and trees and landscape services are not part of the variable expenses that households incur that they throw off to the side waiting for this to pass. We need to emphasize that we are part of the solution, right? That the power of plants in every life is related to this concept of biophilia that I've also been documenting in our industry for over the past decade. Some of you know I've been collecting a lot of research that's been conducted on the value, the benefits of plants from an economic standpoint, environmental standpoint and a health and well-being standpoint. And all those benefits are on my website, by the way. I put the website down here. In fact, I'm just going to pop over to here real quick, and I'm going to go on here, Ellison, ELL, do have to type it right, ellisonshare.tamu.edu. There's a benefits of plants section right here, right? And so I made this statement, I created this page, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, because I feel strongly that our industry, our value proposition has to emphasize these benefits. And I have a summary publication of all the economic, environmental, and health and well-being benefits that I wrote back in 2011. And I updated the health and well-being benefits in a series in the Journal of Environmental Horticulture, which is that's HRI, Horticulture Research Institute. It's the research arm of American Hort. So that's one of the ways in which American Hort is bolstering you during this time period. One of HRI's missions was to document benefits of plants, and I did a series, 4-part series. 3 of them have been published, and one of them's forthcoming any day now. They usually publish in March. So that's coming.
Just a moment.
Uh-oh, Siri thought I was telling her something. Sorry about that. So these 2, 3, 4, and 5 talk about health and well-being benefits. Well, what kind of crisis are we going through right now? A health-related crisis. So let me get back here to my presentation. When we start talking about essential purchases and non-essential purchases, essential businesses and non-essential businesses, we need to convey very clearly that garden centers, that flower, shrubs, and trees are essential purchases, that garden centers are essential businesses, and they need to remain open because plants are a part of in maintaining the health and well-being of citizens all across the country. And that's what we need right now. And plants help scrub volatile organic compounds and other things out of the air. So I could go on and on about that. So this is one thing that when I think about what the impact that we're making in the industry in terms of conveying this value proposition, I have to wonder, right? We're going to find out real quick over the next couple of months, the spring, whether we've been successful in moving the needle in terms of consumer demand for flowers, shrubs, and trees. So this is going to be a very good acid test for us. And of course, I already mentioned American Hort and their work that they're doing on our behalf. I mean, just the other day, Mexico said that they're going to put a halt on approving visas for H-2A workers and so forth. And so American Hort's trying to work out the kinks in the system there to make sure that we have access to our workers and that nothing goes awry in that regard. All right, so there's a lot of uncertainty. This is the last slide, a lot of uncertainty. And I've been going fast, and I've been wanting to leave enough time for Q&A so we can answer a few questions. Yes, there's a lot of uncertainty, but we've faced this before. No, not particularly this particular virus, but we have faced disruptive moments before, as I said in my introduction, right? This is not the first time our back has been against a wall. And those that have been, again, well-positioned in terms of their leverage, in terms of their working capital, in terms of being lean and mean and so forth, lean and efficient, and got their value proposition right, those are the ones that have done okay during those disruptive moments. So again, I don't any adjustments that you should have been making to those 4 should have been 18 months, 24 months ago. It is what it is, right? So you move from today and you try to do the things that are going to position your business the best. And I think one of that's getting that health and well-being benefits messaging out there as quickly and as broadly as we can. All right, so with that, I'm going to stop there. Chris, let's see if there's any questions.
Okay, let me take a quick look here. I don't have any questions. Oh, wait, I do have some questions. Excuse me.
Yeah,
I would just find it
highly unusual to have no questions on a day like today.
Yeah. So, do you have any advice for nurseries, garden centers, landscape companies in dealing with this uncertainty and in dealing with, beyond what you've said?
Oh, beyond what I've said, yeah. I mean, there's some basic things, particularly in terms of COVID-19. Um, your workforce is basically your family within the business, right? And just as the concerns that you have for your family, your blood family, you have those same concerns for every employee that works for you. So you got to make sure that you've got the right sanitary conditions in place and that you're following protocols that will help mitigate the likelihood of that COVID-19 spreading within the workplace. Right? You got to provide a safe work environment, and you got to be a leader at this point. Right? It's not just to put our head in the sand and hope it's going to pass. Those folks right now are looking to you for leadership. And that's the yoke that you've got to pick up and carry and be very open in terms of your communication and what your strategies are for working through the spring and making sure that we're going to survive and that we're going to be profitable during this spring. All right, so you set up the sanitary conditions in the workplace and the lunchroom and so forth, and the hand sanitizer, all of the usual things. And by the way, the CDC has an excellent website for businesses on COVID-19. That I don't remember the exact URL right off the top of my head, but you can Google COVID-19 CDC guide for businesses. Right? Guide for businesses. And they have an excellent response in terms of COVID-19 within the workplace, right? So excellent. So be sure and check out CDC's website on for businesses in response to COVID-19. So that's above and beyond the four things I talked about. That's a given, right? Now, why would I even have to say that? That seems so intuitively obvious. Well, yeah, but it's not simply a matter of doing it. Again, you got to show the leadership, and you got to communicate to your team, every single employee from top, upper level management to the frontline employees. You got to convey what it is you're doing, and you got to exercise some leadership. So those are just some of the things that make sure you do those.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Hall. So one of the things that you mentioned was obviously the predictions are very imprecise and difficult to make, but you mentioned that your feeling was that the recession that we may be facing could be shorter than 18 months. I got a question basically questioning that timeline, saying that given the lag time in relief packages that may occur and consumer spending turning down, overlaid with businesses perhaps scaling back on investment, what gives you hope that it'll be less than 18 months?
Well, the hope is that we contain this thing, right? That's the greatest degree of uncertainty we have is through how long is it going to take us to contain it, and of course that depends on how quickly we get the testing out there and how quickly we can or how effectively we can mitigate the spread of this outbreak. So again, I'm optimistic when I say it's Q2 and Q3 and we're looking at November, right? I will give whoever asked that question, I'll give you the credit there for recognizing that this could very well last 18 months, like some of my fellow economists are talking about. However, even in the midst of that, the effect is not going to go on in terms of spending. I mean, remember, I talked about there's a certain amount of spending that consumers are going to do. They have to buy food. They got to buy clothes to a certain extent. And there's some discretionary types of purchases. And recreation services, well, I mentioned services. That reminds me to say that 60% of what we buy is usually service related. 40% of what we spend our money on is goods, right? So all the services almost 4% of our household budget is related to recreation services, 4.5% recreation goods. So whether that plays out to, do we substitute landscape services and lawn and garden goods instead of recreation there? In the past, yes. Yeah, we would have said that. And so that would have been some of the discretionary things that people would have cut back on. But remember the staycations that were made in the previous, the dot-com collapse and so forth. When people stayed at home, they gardened and landscaped more because they were, gardening and landscaping was in the top 5 in terms of leisure time activities. Now gardening and landscaping is not even in the top 10. So again, have we done a good job in conveying our value proposition? Are people going to garden and landscape more now than what they did? So, in the past, before the Great Recession, when we had a recession, we actually sold more in terms of the green industry products and services. People stayed at home and they did those things. So the question is, there's a great big question mark, just like this big question mark that I had in the previous slide here, right? This great big question mark right there, great big question mark in terms of how people are going to respond in the face of this uncertainty. So again, that's a long-winded question or answer to that question, but I recognize what you're saying. It could, but I'm kind of giving a best case scenarios. We get on top of this, then most of the impacts are going to be felt in quarter 2 and quarter 3.
Okay, thank you. One of the things that you mentioned about being impacted by the COVID-19 is global trade. As you also mentioned, we've basically had trade disputes with virtually all our major trading partners around the world over the last few years. But it seems like that war is settling down somewhat. We've had recent agreements with China. How do you think the COVID-19 is going to impact the trade, I guess, the warming of our trade relations?
Yeah, I think it'll make it warmer. I think you'll see a tendency for folks to kind of reduce the hostility a little bit and to come to the table and talk some more. This is one of those events where that hardline stance is kind of mitigated when you have U.S. manufacturing that's relying on inputs that are imported from China, India, wherever. That's there's a lot of pressure there. And you look at steel and aluminum, for example. The steel and aluminum industry have taken it on the chin, and I know that there's been some rhetoric that's actually improved their sector. It hasn't, right? Their input costs are higher, and they have lost money. Every job we've created in the steel and aluminum industry has cost us $900,000 for each job that we created. So we've made some gains from the trade, but not enough to justify a hardline stance. So you notice that those discussions are taking a back seat right now. That's because that's of lesser importance. And I don't think there's going to be more trade restrictions put on in the short run. I think we'll see more lessening of those restrictions, as you were saying, Chris. And so there may be a tendency to be willing to come to the table and renegotiate some of that stuff.
Okay, thank you. Another question that came in is one of the big points that I got out of your benchmarking presentation, the portion of the presentation, was the importance of shrink and basically waste or dumping or whatever other label you want to put on it. So given the possible reduction of sales and even the possibility that some garden centers might need to close at least temporarily due to the virus situation, any advice for growers and retailers in managing their inventories going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of that depends, Chris, on the sector in which they sell to. It makes a little bit of a difference here whether a grower is selling into the garden center sector or whether they're selling into the box store sector. Because from most of my conversations with growers who are selling to box stores, it's been pretty much business as usual. Now, bear in mind that that's been mostly southern growers because we start the season earlier, But most of the growers on the southern tier, whether they sell to Lowe's, Depot, or Walmart, it's been business as usual, and sales have actually been pretty good. Now, the jury is still out about whether that plays out that way. Now, if you're in the selling to the garden center sector, it's a very fragmented industry. You have some garden centers that have high degree of professionalism. They are merchandising experts. And then you have the same opposite end of the spectrum. It's a continuum. You have those that, quite frankly, I'm surprised that they survived. It's been the rising boats, the rising tide has floated all boats. And so some of those are going to be exiting. So if you're depending on some of those customers that exit, that's right, you're going to have more speculation part of that shrink, right? So remember, it's production losses, credits and allowances, and speculation losses. And so that's product that's grown, that's not sold. And that's where the speculation losses will be much higher. However, we should be doing a customer analysis every single year where we're ranking all of our customers top to bottom, number 1 to number 200 or whatever, in terms of the sales that they represent, but more importantly, the profitability that they represent. What's been the gross margin for each one of those customers? And when you start measuring customers based off of profitability, you get a little different ranking. So we should be winnowing out our bottom third of customers and replacing them with folks that are more like our top third, and developing more strategic relationships with those garden centers. So this is where we're going to be very creative, because one of the problems that's happened in the past is when we have a shock like this, or whether most of it's been because of weather. Even though a grower will have pre-booked sales to a garden center will say in the middle of the season, you know what, I booked this many units, I only need half that. And so they start reneging on some of those pre-booked sales. Well, that's partly on the mostly on the garden center, but it's also partly on the grower for not developing a system there where there's an incentive for those garden centers to go ahead and take the product, or the converse of that, there's a penalty, a severe penalty, if they don't take the product. If you don't book such and such percentage this year, you forego the right to pre-book your order for next year, which works well when supply is in relatively stable shape. But when we get to an oversupply situation, that kind of falls apart. And that's where we have, unfortunately, that's the mistake our industry has made in the past, is we've gotten too many times in an oversupply situation, too much product rather than an undersupply. And the Great Recession took care of that for us. And for several years, we were the beneficiary of an undersupply, particularly of certain product segments like 1.5, 2-inch trees. And now I don't know that we're in that same undersupply situation. I think we're dangerously close to being oversupplied again. So that's just my anecdotal. I have no data to back that up, because we don't capture units in terms of any USDA data or economic census data or so forth. So that's strictly anecdotal of my travels around the country and trying to read the tea leaves.
No, I think you're probably pretty close to accurate there, and that brings me to a kind of a follow-up question.
Yeah.
One of the real challenges, as you know, of growers that are producing perennial crops is the lag time. Growers are making decisions now, or they've already made decisions of what they're going to plant for, sale 2, 3, 4 years from now.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on how growers should adjust their planting plans based on this, or do you think this is going to kind of come and go and we'll be back to normal?
Yeah, this is one of those that I don't think this is the type of a contraction that's going to cause a change in tastes and preferences, right? It's a different kind of downturn than that. So this is where it's going to be an impact on demand in terms of the quantity of demand, not necessarily the quality of demand. So we should be doing, in addition to that customer analysis I was talking about, we should be doing a SKU rationalization analysis and measuring all of our SKUs, stock keeping unit, all of the individual products that we grow by size, by variety, etc. We should be analyzing each one in terms of the sales that they represent and the margin that they represent. So over time, we should be getting rid of those low margin products, unless it's just one of those things, a commodity product that a buyer's got to have, and we grow it just to keep that particular buyer happy. Then that, okay, I can see that that's the strategic intent behind that particular strategy. But in general, we should be analyzing those SKUs and only and trying to, again, winnow out those less margin, those less profitable SKUs and replacing those, and or not even replacing them, just narrowing our product mix, maybe being a little more specialized. There's a lot of different ways to crack this nut, and that's the beauty of this industry. You stick 100 growers in the room, 1,000 growers in the room. There's 100 different production systems, 1,000 different production systems that are out there. They all have different facilities. They're either growing in the ground, in container, pot and pot. You got all different varieties, and they got the climatic zones that take an influence. So it's not like producing widgets, as we all know. There's an art to this, and so it's hard to compensate and account for the art in this when you're looking at 3, 4, 5 years out. But Chris, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't see that we're seeing any sort of change or any sort of disruptions that's going to cause a change in the types of plants that we're going to be growing, instead of whether or not they're going to be growing them or they're going to be buying them to begin with. And this goes back to this biophilia principle here, where are we conveying our propositions, value propositions, so they see the benefits that plants are going to drive and that they'll derive from having plants in their interior scapes and their landscapes.
Okay. Well, we're approaching the top of the hour, and we committed to do a 1-hour webinar and respect everyone's time. So any final thoughts, Charlie, before we sign off?
Yeah, I'll just close with saying, reiterating my earlier point, is that we've been in we've been in disruptive moments before. All right, this is a new wrinkle to a disruptive moment, and there'll be a contraction because of that, but there's nothing inherent that's going to cause a structural change in the way that people buy. It causes a structural change in how much they buy in the short run. And of course, there will be ripples all down the supply chain. Going back to that very first graph, there's going to be manufacturers that don't have the cash flow to make it. There's going to be distributors that don't have the cash flow to make it. There's going to be trucking firms that they're going to go out, and there's going to be disruption. So there's going to be shakeout in every single economic downturn. There's a shakeout. So we can't assume that we're not going to have that shakeout. We will. And there will be some growers, landscape service providers, and retailers that won't be here this time next year, or maybe it's a slower death than that. But that is how things operate. Are there efficiencies that are gained? Are there lessons that are learned? Absolutely. Then the key is to really hone in on what those strategic lessons that exist, and to put our next contingency plan in place, right? So we should be implementing our current contingency plan and then working on our next contingency plan based off what we learn. So I tend to be referred to as Professor Silver Lining, and though economics is called the dismal science, and we economists get that moniker all the time, I'm still optimistic because I know the power of plants. We just have to convey that in a way that consumers get it and they recognize as being essentials in their lives rather than luxuries they can throw aside during such downturns. So I want to thank everybody. Chris, I'm going to send you these slides that people can actually have the slides. In addition, they'll see the recording. So I don't know if you'll throw those on the website or whatever.
We will.
But I offer that to the audience today. The actual PowerPoint slides, if you want to use this for some of your own dialogue within the company, then I'll be happy to share those slides. And they can either go through you, Chris, or they can email me directly, and I'll send them the PowerPoint. Be happy to.
Yep. No, we'll post it at farmcrediteast.com/webinars, like along with all our webinar info. So thank you very much, Charlie.
You bet. Everybody have a great day.
Okay, thanks. So with that, as I mentioned, farmcrediteast.com/webinars, that's where all our webinars live, past, present, and future. So with that, I will sign off and wish everyone a good day and stay healthy out there. Thanks.